Good afternoon. This is Kathleen Drew, Chair of the Energy Facility Site Evaluation Council, calling our December 20th, December regular monthly meeting to order. Ms. Grantham, will you call the roll?
Certainly. Department of Commerce,
Elizabeth Osborne, present.
Department of Ecology,
Eli Levitt, present.
Department of Fish and Wildlife,
Mike Livingston, present.
Department of Natural Resources,
Lenny Young, present.
Utilities and Transportation Commission,
Stacy Brewster, present.
for local government and optional state agencies, for the Horse Heaven Project for Benton County, Ed Brost,
Ed Brost is present.
for the Badger Mountain Project for Douglas County, Jordan Julio,
Jordan Julie.
for the Watoma Solar Project for Benton County, Dave Sharp, the Washington State Department of Transportation, Paul Gonseth,
Paul Gonseth, present.
for the Hop Hill Solar Project for Benton County, Paul Crouppen,
Paul Crouppen, present.
for the Carriger Solar Project for Clickitat County, Matt Childs,
Matt Childs, present.
Assistant Attorney Generals, John Thompson, Jenna Slocum, and Zach Packer. Administrative Law Judges, Adam Torum,
This is Judge Torum, present.
Laura Bradley, Dan Gerard, and Joni Deerfield. And for council staff, Sonia Bumpus, Amy Hofkemeyer,
Present.
Amy Moon,
Amy Moon, present.
Stu Henderson, Joan Owens,
Present.
Dave Walker, Sonia Scavland, Lisa Massengale, Sarah Randolph,
Sarah
Randolph, present.
Sean Green, and Lance Caputo said he was present in chat. John Barnes, Joanne Snarsky,
Joanne Snarsky, present.
Alex Shiley is present. Allie Smith, Carl Halapa, and Audra Allen. For operational updates, Kittitas Valley Wind Project,
Eric Malbartis, present.
Wild Horse Wind Power Project,
Jennifer Galbraith, present.
Grace Harbor Energy Center,
Chris Shine, present.
Chehalis Generation Facility, Columbia Generating Station,
Felicia Nahara Paxton, present.
Columbia Solar, and Goose Prairie Solar.
Jacob Christ, present.
Thank you. And do we have someone present for the Council for the Environment?
Yeah, Sarah Reineveld, present.
Thank you. Chair, there is a quorum for the regular council and all of the outside councils. Thank you.
Thank you. Next item on our agenda is the proposed agenda you have in front of you. That proposed agenda, is there a motion to approve the proposed agenda?
Lenny Young,
Stacy.
so moved.
Stacy Brewster, second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? The agenda is adopted. Moving on to the meeting minutes from November 15th, 2023, the monthly meeting minutes. You have the draft in front of you. Is there a motion to approve the meeting minutes from November 15th?
Elizabeth Osborne, so moved.
Second?
Stacy Brewster, second.
Thank you. I have one correction on page 22, line 4. Within 60 days of receipt of the council's recommendation, the governor not the government, will take one of three actions. That's my only correction. Any others?
Yes, this is Stacy Brewster. On page 42, line 12, it says shrub set. I believe that should say shrub step.
Okay. Thank you. All those in favor of adopting the minutes with those two changes, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The minutes are adopted. Project updates. Kittitas Valley, Mr. Melbardis.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, FSEC, and council staff. For the reporting period of November, I did have a non-routine item to report. It was a neighboring, non-participating landowner complaint. The complaint was for shadow flicker. Many years ago, probably 6 months after operational phase, we implemented a system that automatically curtailed a couple of turbines that were known to have caused shadow flicker. And the system is fully automatic and it runs on a schedule. Our daylight savings time ended on November 5th. The complaint came in on November 7th, and it was due to the failure of the automated system to follow the time change. So we had it corrected, and it's been working fine ever since. We continue to monitor it, but it was just a flip of the controller.
Thank you.
Any questions about that?
Any questions from council members? Thank you, and thank you for correcting it and finding that quickly. Moving on to Wild Horse Wind Power Project. Ms.
Yes.
Galbraith.
Thank you, Chair Drew, council members and staff. This is Jennifer Galbraith with Puget Sound Energy representing the Wild Horse Wind Facility. I have one non-routine update for the month of November. In accordance with the fire control plan and the fire services agreement with Kittitas Valley Fire District Number 2, PSE and the district met to review and train on the fire safety plan, including site orientation and maps, site access, identification of potential electrical hazards, and lessons learned from the 2022 Vantage fire. And that's all I have.
Thank you. Chehalis Generation Facility. Is Mr. Smith online or is it?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, there. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members and staff. This is Jeremy Smith, the operations manager representing the Chehalis Generation Facility. I have nothing non-routine to note for the month of November.
Okay, thank you. Grays Harbor Energy Center, Mr. Sharon.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members, and FSEC staff. This is Chris Sharon, plant manager, Grays Harbor Energy Center, and I have nothing non-routine to report for the month of November either.
Thank you. Columbia Solar, is Mr. Cushing there? Or Ms. Randolph?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members and staff. For the record, this is Sarah Randolph, site specialist, providing an update for Columbia Solar. The facility update is provided in your packet. There were no non-routine updates to report.
Thank you. Columbia Generating Station, Ms. Nahira Paxton.
Good afternoon, Chair Drew, council members and staff. This is Felicia Nahara Paxton providing updates for Energy Northwest Columbia Generating Station. In November, we had routine operations. On November 20th, we did have one update. The FSEC provided additional questions on the June 2023 circulating water oil release that occurred. Energy Northwest submitted follow-up information on the incident to FSEC as requested on December 12th, 23.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goose Prairie Solar, Mr. Christ.
Yeah, good afternoon, Chair Drew, FSEC Council and staff. So this is Jacob Christ, Senior Project Manager on behalf of Brookfield Renewable, providing the Goose Prairie Solar project update. So for construction updates, starting with the substation, reported last month that we were still waiting on MPT deliveries. So we can say that we've successfully had both MPTs delivered and the build out is complete. So the substation build out for the rest of the remaining structures will now continue in anticipation for the remaining year that we expect to receive sometime early next year. Pre-drilling activities on the job site is complete. Pile driving and perimeter fence continue along with medium voltage cable install, and all three of those activities are nearing completion. Racking installation started last month. And then looking ahead to January, we've got some module and inverter install that will start in early January. We do continue with ongoing environmental inspections weekly by WSP and a weekly call with the FSEC specialist. And then for a public outreach update, I don't have the final numbers yet, but we did successfully complete a project, Toy Drive, with monetary donations and toys both. I'm just awaiting some final numbers on that so I can report in the January meeting to the council. Any questions?
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Christ? Thank you.
Thank you.
High Top in Austria, Ms. Randolph.
Thank you. For the record, this is Sarah Randolph, Site Specialist for High Top in Austria. FSEC staff are continuing to work with the developer on pre-construction requirements and plans. We have no other updates at this time.
Thank you. Whistling Ridge, Mr. Barnes, are you giving Mr. Caputo's update?
Yes, I am, Chair Drew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. This is John Barnes on behalf of Lance Caputo, who is the site specialist for this project. Staff are working to schedule this hearing for the Whistling Ridge extension request and transfer request. Details of the hearing will be announced once they are available.
Thank you. Desert Claim Project Update, Ms. Moon.
Good afternoon, Council Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is Amy Moon providing a project update on Desert Claim. The Desert Claim Site Certification Agreement Amendment Number 2, as approved by the council at the November 15th, 2023 council meeting, has been finalized and posted to the FSEC Desert Claim Site Certification Agreement public website. There are no further project updates at this time. Does the council have any questions?
Any questions for Ms. Moon? Maybe that is better. Thank you. I apologize. I'm trying to figure out how to get us out of the dark that I see on our screen here because of the lack of light. So maybe, do you have a light too? It just is in the one image. It's just a dark area. Apologize for this momentary delay. Okay, thank you. A little bit better. Moving on to Badger Mountain project update, Ms. Snarsky.
Thank you, Chair Drew, and good afternoon, council members. For the record, this is Joanne Snarsky, the siting specialist for Badger Mountain Solar. Progress is continuing with the development of the draft environmental impact statement for the proposed Badger Mountain Solar project. Efforts are also continuing on the development of the supplemental cultural resources survey. A work plan has been completed for the initial ground survey. Currently, we are looking at the possibility of completing the initial survey work in January if the snow remains at bay in the proposed project boundary. Additionally, we are working with the Department of Natural Resources to obtain an agreement for our subcontractors to gain access to the relatively small portion of the project that is located on state lands. Finally, we hope the more detailed survey work will be completed this spring. As a reminder, the findings of this survey will inform the cultural resources section of the draft environmental impact statement. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions for Ms. Snarsky? Okay, thank you. Watoma Solar project update, Mr. Barnes.
Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. Once again, this is John Barnes on behalf of Lance Caputo, who is siting specialist for this project. Applicants for the Watoma Solar Energy Project recently submitted the final supplemental cultural resource survey requested by FSEC and the Department of Archaeology, and Historic Preservation, and we are presently reviewing the report for compliance. Staff are also coordinating with the Yakama Nation's Cultural Resource Program staff on identifying potential mitigation to form our SEPA threshold determination. Lastly, staff are currently working with our AAGs and the Office of Administrative Hearing to ensure that we are prepared for the forthcoming adjudicative proceeding for this project.
Thank you. Hop Hill Solar, Mr. Barnes.
Sorry for the delay. Thank you, Chair Drew, council members. For the record, this is John Barnes, FSEC staff for the Hop Hill application. We are continuing to coordinate and review the application with our contractor, contracted agencies, and tribal governments. At this time, the applicant would like to request a 12-month application review extension. The original application review deadline is set to expire December 22nd, 2023. The 12-month extension would allow the applicant to complete data collection studies needed for FSEC to be able to conduct our SEPA review and determination. The applicant has drafted an application review extension letter that has been placed on the FSEC website for public review and comments ahead of the meeting from December 11th through December 15th. No comments were received. If granted, the new application deadline would become December 22nd, 2024. At this time, staff recommends the council to vote to approve the application extension now in front of you. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions for Mr. Barnes? The letter is in your packets, and on the screen are there any comments by council members? Is there a motion to approve the extension request from Bright Night for the Hop Hill Solar application?
Lenny Young, I move to approve the extension request.
Second?
Stacy Brewster. Second.
Okay. Thank you. Discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed? The extension request is approved. Thank you. Carriger Solar Project, Ms. Snarsky.
Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is Joanne Snarsky, the siting specialist for Carriger Solar. FSEC staff continue to work with the Carriger Solar applicant to address anticipated visual impacts from the proposed project. In accordance with RCW 80.50.090 sub 3 sub A, the applicant is allowed to provide clarification or make changes to the proposal to mitigate the anticipated environmental impacts. We recently agreed on a few supplemental visual simulations that we believe will help us better understand the potential options for mitigating visual impacts. When received, these new simulations will lead to further discussions with the applicant and will hopefully result in a formal written response from the applicant to our initial SEPA notification to them. Staff, with support from our Assistant Attorney General, are very near final execution of an interagency agreement for the completion of a traditional cultural property study by the Yakima Nation for this site. All of the language in the contract has been mutually agreed to and is currently with the Yakima Nation for their processing and signature. This contract will also now serve as a model for additional TCP studies at other proposed facilities with tribal cultural resource concerns. Are there any questions?
Are there any questions for Ms. Snarsky? I don't see any questions from council members. Thank you. Moving on to the Horse Heaven Wind Farm project, Ms. Moon, project update.
Good afternoon, Council Chair Drew and FSEC council members. For the record, this is Amy Moon providing an update on the Horse Heaven Wind project. Since issuing the Horse Heaven Wind project final environmental site assessment known as the EIS on October 31st, 2023, FSEC staff have been addressing council feedback and questions posed at the November 15th FSEC council meeting and the November 29th special council meeting regarding mitigation measures. The follow-up on the questions posed at the November council meeting regarding the roles of the Washington Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, in fire response and suppression, FSEC staff sent the questions to DNR. And I want to go over those questions and responses from DNR. There's 5 in total. Question 1, we asked, does DNR have any project-specific concerns regarding fire suppression, for example, access to the site or access to fire suppression materials? And the DNR response was DNR does not have the direct fire protection responsibility for the proposed project area. Second question, we asked, would DNR be one of the potential responders to a range fire in the Horse Heaven Hills, specifically within the proposed project location? The DNR response, DNR could be a potential responder through agreements with fire districts and/or state mobilization. DNR is the primary responder for wildfire aviation on non-federal land statewide. The third question from the council was, would the proposed turbine heights up to 657 feet maximum total height, ground to blade tip, affect fire suppression methodology? The DNR response, turbines up to 657 feet would severely restrict or prohibit the use of tactical aircraft, known as UAS, which is unmanned aircraft system. We could commonly just call this drones. So turbines up to that 657-foot height would severely restrict or prohibit the use of drones for tactical fire suppression. Question 4. What is the typical height planes and helicopters fly when responding to a range fire for suppression? DNR responded, nearly all tactical wildland missions are conducted below 500 feet above ground level. And the last question, 5, are there any other aerial criteria or accommodations for planes or helicopters that will require DNR fire response related to access to water and/or fire retardants? And follow-up is any specific turnaround criteria for the aircraft? The DNR response, nothing specific. The density and spacing of the towers would essentially create a no-fly zone over the entire project area. we would apply an additional safety buffer of 1 to 2 tower heights around the project to ensure safe separation for aircraft operations. And I also wanted to mention that before this meeting, we did post to the website that the council may be taking action, and we did receive 9 comments from the public. They were general comments against the project. Are there any questions on those DNR questions and responses?
Are there any questions from council members?
Amy, could you reread the third question and response?
About the turbine heights?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so turbines up to 657 feet would severely restrict or prohibit the use of tactical aircraft and unmanned aircraft system known as drones for tactical fire suppression.
Thanks for rereading it. The first time around, I didn't quite get it. The response actually deals with 2 different things: tactical aircraft, which are different from
Yes, sorry.
unmanned aerial systems. So
Yeah.
it's both piloted aircraft and drones that would be involved here.
Yes, I believe that's the answer. I did kind of flub my acronyms and explaining when I first read that. So thank you for asking again.
Thank you.
Ms. Moon, what I heard from the collection of questions, and thank you for getting those, certainly is that in the area that on the project itself,
yeah,
that would be a non-fly zone. However, they would consider 1 to 2 turbine lengths from the closest turbine as their safety zone outside of or from where the turbines are to where they would be able to use their equipment. Is that correct?
So I'm not sure if that's quite how that should be interpreted, and there may be somebody on the line from DNR that could respond to that. I took the answer as 1 to 2 tower heights above the project.
Oh,
but it could be like you posed outside the project limits, and I could certainly follow up on that.
okay. Do we have somebody online to answer questions? Okay, that would be helpful because I was looking at it similarly to how we look at the distance between a turbine and a neighboring resident. So that would be good to clarify.
Okay, I'll do that. And any other questions on this? So no.
Here, Amy, I had a question for you.
Okay, thanks.
So this is new information for council to consider. We've been working through with staff on the additional mitigation we might want to apply beyond the final EIS. So how should we anticipate being able to use this information to look at, various turbine strings and how to propose some mitigation?
That is a fairly complex question, Mr. Livingston. Amy Hoffmeyer might be able to help out on this, or Sean Green. We are looking at more dialogue with the DNR on their answers to this, and particularly on whether they have any mitigation measure ideas or criteria. And I'm hoping that I can report that back to you in January. But as of yet, partly due to the holiday season and the end of the year, I wasn't able to have that dialogue with DNR. So can we hold a more formal response until January?
Yes, absolutely. I just wanted to make sure I understood when that we might be able to get that information. So thank you, Amy. I appreciate that.
You're welcome. Any further questions? or
Just if we
comments?
could pause for a second, Ms. Hofgemeyer is trying to ensure her microphone's on.
All right.
There we go.
I think I have a working
Okay.
microphone. Okay. So thank you, Councilmember Livingston. One of the things to continue the discussion, Sean Green is available this afternoon to discuss some of the mitigation changes that we have heard the council may want to consider this afternoon. And so if the council would like to discuss some additional mitigation in response to the concern for additional space either around or above the footprint of the project, we can certainly work to clarify that. But if the council would like to consider mitigation, that can be discussed this afternoon when the council is discussing the other mitigation measures being presented. And when giving staff direction on what to prepare, we can incorporate some of those details to then present to the council ahead of the January meeting.
Okay. Thank you. Ms. Moon, is that the end of your report, and are we ready to move forward to the mitigation discussion?
That's basically the end of my report. I was going to introduce Sean Green, saying he's available for any questions or dialogue about mitigation measures. Also, staff would like the council, well, I'll hold this. We'll just go into the mitigation measures. So yes, I'm done, Chair Green. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you. Mr. Green.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Drew and council members. For the record, this is Sean Green, SEPA specialist for FSEC. There are two sets of proposed changes to mitigation measures that I want to walk you through today, both of which were provided to council members last week for your preliminary review. And I'll see if I can get my screen share to work. Okay, looks like this is working. So we can just start going through these. These are all changes that staff have prepared in response to council discussions during the 2 November meetings. So the first is for Air 1. There was some council discussion about how this measure, which limits the speed for project vehicles to 15 miles per hour on site, there was discussion by the council about how this would be managed and enforced. We have proposed changes that were developed in coordination with our consultant that would indicate a posting of signage, training to all employees, periodic speed checks by construction contractors, health and safety officers to be reviewed monthly, and a requirement by the applicant to notify FSEC of any identified routine exceedance of the speed limit alongside a corrective action plan. And I guess I'll provide council this opportunity to discuss.
Are there any comments or questions about this updated mitigation item? If not, I think we'll just I'll just ask you to raise your hand if you would like to discuss the changes that were made, and otherwise we'll presume that they're understood by the council. Okay.
Okay, and just for clarification, does that understood by the council, does that indicate that the council would like for the mitigation as it is now proposed to be incorporated into the
Yes.
the potential SCA in this format? Okay, thank you.
Yes, should they take that action?
Yes,
So,
absolutely.
right. We haven't gotten that far yet, but yes.
Agreed. Okay. The next measure is in regard to culvert installation best management practices. There was discussion by council members as to whether the applicant should be required to adhere to WDFW fish passage best management practices in lieu of U.S. Department of Agriculture best management practices. In staff review, WDFW BMPs meet or exceed all USDA BMPs. Okay. The third measure is Water 6, which deals with spill response equipment in project vehicles. There were council concerns about which vehicles that would be present on project areas would be subject to this requirement, for which case we have updated the mitigation to indicate that this would apply to project vehicles, specifically vehicles owned by the project that regularly access the site, specifically excluding employee personal vehicles. And there was also some council discussion about what type of equipment would be required. So there has been some specificity added in that regard. Are there any comments here? Okay. The next measure is vegetation 6, which dealt with how mitigation measures would be updated in the event that legislative requirements change between the point of execution of a potential SCA and the actual time of decommissioning of the project. And the language has been changed to indicate that if legislative requirements at the time of decommissioning are more restrictive than at the time of the execution of the SCA, then those higher level of requirements would take precedence. And this also clarifies that any potential weakening of legislative requirements would not undercut any mitigation measures within an executed SCA. Are there any questions here? All right. The next is Wildlife 1, which is the post-construction bird and bat fatality monitoring program. This didn't actually come up through council discussion, but this was a staff recognition that at several points within this mitigation measure, duties were assigned to the technical advisory committee that should have been assigned to the pre-operational technical advisory group, or pardon me, the pre-construction technical advisory group, just based on the timing of when those two technical groups would exist. So this is an error correction on our part.
So if I can ask about this one, post-construction bird and bat fatality monitoring.
Yes.
But before
so
the initiation of operation.
Yes, and I can clarify. Part of this mitigation measure involves the development of monitoring plans prior to the start of project construction, and the development of those plans would need to go to the PTAG for review, because at that point in time, the TAC would not exist yet. Okay. Once the project has begun construction and those monitoring plans are in effect, then the TAC would take its role as oversight and technical advisory.
So it would transfer to the new group.
Correct.
Okay. Mr. Young, did you have a question?
Yeah, it was just addressed. The clarification I was looking for was just provided.
Okay, thank you.
Any further questions on this change? Okay. The next is Habitat 1. This is the mitigation requirement that would not allow project components within areas that have been identified as medium to very high linkage for wildlife movement corridors. As the mitigation is currently written, there is a process through which the applicant could cite project components within those medium to very high linkage areas with additional mitigation and management plans as outlined in the existing text. There was some council discussion in the November meetings about whether this avoidance of movement corridor should be a firm area of non-allowance in without the possibility of exceptions as outlined in the current mitigation. So this is one where we would like the council's guidance on which version they prefer.
And this is on the movement corridors.
Correct.
Mr. Livingston.
Yeah, I appreciate staff hearing those concerns, and I like the changes that have been made. So I'll just give you my thumbs up on that. Thank you.
Mr. Young?
Yep, ditto what Mr. Livingston just said. I prefer the changed version.
So one question I have is that there would be a process if the applicant wants to propose some connective or some project components, because this eliminates all project components. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So as currently written, there is a process through which the applicant could request to cite project components within medium to very high linkage areas for wildlife movement. And there are various steps that they would have to go through, and the development of a corridor mitigation plan that would need FSEC approval prior to the allowance of any project components within those areas under the current mitigation. With the changes that are being presented to the council here, that process would not exist, and no project components would be allowed to be cited within medium to very high linkage areas. And in the email that council members received last week that included this presentation and the subsequent one, there was some data indicating how much of the project is currently within one of those medium to very high linkage corridors, just as an indication of how much of the project would potentially be excluded. And there is also the option for the council to suggest changes here that differ from the changes that are currently on your screen. If there's
would you happen to have a map of the high?
Yes, I can find one.
Thank you. I find that helpful.
So the areas highlighted on this map in yellow are rated as medium linkage. The areas in light red are high linkage, and dark red are very high linkage. There is no area of very high linkage within the project lease boundary. So the
Okay.
project components that would be excluded are anything in yellow or light red.
Okay. And that would include linking up to any transmission throughout the project as well.
With the change that is currently as per on the presentation that the council has access to, that would include all project components. There is the potential, if the council wishes to allow certain necessary project components or interconnecting transmission lines, if the council wants to give us direction on that.
Mr. Livingston or Mr. Young, thoughts?
Just sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say is looking at this again on the map, and Chair Drew, reflecting your question, we might want to be able to consider a proposal from the applicant for an exception in the medium but I would be opposed to anything in the high or very high.
And the high or very high is the darker color, which to me looks like orange on the
Yeah,
screen.
it looks like orange. What I'm specifically looking
Yeah.
at is that area kind of in the middle of
Right.
what we're looking at right now. That's like a yellow
Mhm.
area between orange to the south and orange to the north. And if the applicant felt it was absolutely critical to somehow connect the eastern and western parts of the project through that yellow area, we might, and I'm just throwing this out for others' thoughts, we might want to allow the applicant to propose an exception in that area, but not in the orange. Just putting this out for conversation.
Right. Right. And the criteria, well, the criteria would have to be made that, right, as to why that would be needed.
Yeah.
Mr. Livingston?
Yeah, I think I support that. Are we talking transmission? Are we talking turbine strings? Are we talking all project proponents? Councilman Young, what were
I
you
think
proposing?
we can define it as transmission components if you'd like.
Yeah, that's in line with what I'm just thinking as we're looking at this, is that it would not include turbines or fixed infrastructure, but if there was some transmission connecting need between the eastern and western portions of the project, again, not saying this would definitely be allowed, but it would be something that we could mirror that language where the applicant could propose, and we would look at whether that would be something that would be appropriate or not.
Okay. That makes sense to me. That's what I was wanting to look at. So let's say exception potentially based on the information and whether or not it what the impact is on wildlife for transmission components.
Okay, and just for my own clarification, it would be a disallowance of any project components other than transmission lines in any areas with a medium or above linkage, but the exception process with the movement mitigation plan could be allowed for transmission components only within medium linkage.
Yes.
Okay, we can prepare a version of that mitigation incorporating those details.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions on this change? Okay. The next is species 5, which is the species-specific mitigation for the ferruginous hawk. There are two versions of changes that have been prepared based on council input. The first of which essentially turns the 2-mile buffer area surrounding the ferruginous hawk nests into a firm buffer and not allowing any project components within that 2-mile radius under any condition, as opposed to the original version, which allowed for the siting of project components within a 2-mile buffer if the applicant could demonstrate that the nesting site and nesting habitat within that area was no longer viable for the species. And I can move through the 4 parts.
So let's talk about what this includes. Project components are no solar arrays, no turbines, and no transmission, as well as battery storage and roads.
Yes, with the change before you, that this would include all project components, though again, the council can provide us direction if they want exceptions for some components or others, or maintaining the original mitigation measure, whichever the council prefers.
Do you have a map? Which I don't know that we have one which would identify all the project components. But perhaps one of the ones that we have indicates turbines in red
Mhm.
that are with, one of the criteria is, there we go.
Yes, so the council has a version of this map available to them that includes the actual location or the buffers of the ferruginous hawk nests. This is the public-facing version that is present within the EIS. And one of the criteria that went into identifying which of these turbines are, they're classified by level of impact. And one of the criteria that went into identifying their level of impact was their proximity to ferruginous hawk nests.
So can you kind of circle the area that we just looked at, if you can transpose from the map to the other, right? Okay, where that wildlife corridor is. Where's the highway? Where's Highway 82? Is it I-82?
Yes.
Am I right
So,
about that? Thank
Highway
you.
82.
Oh, you can show them side by side. How
Yes.
clever.
I-82 is this band right here. So it's
Uh-huh.
actually east of the movement corridor
Okay.
for wildlife.
And where is it? Okay, there we are.
Yes, it is right here for this map.
Okay. And yet on the east side of I-82, we still have ferruginous hawk impact or other impact. We're not just saying that's ferruginous hawk, right?
Yes, those are turbines that have what are defined here as the class 3 impact. Again, the council has confidential versions of this map that show buffers around ferruginous hawk nests, so they can see themselves which of these turbines are actually within
So
those buffers.
my point in bringing this up is that I actually want to bring up the East Solar Field. I believe that the East Solar Field, which, right, you can, yeah, and the applicant has already removed the portions that are west of I-82, but right there on the map, you can see those portions of the East Solar Field. And if we go forward with this proposal, that my belief, correct me if I'm wrong, is that that would be a project component which would not be allowed.
If the changes that were shown to species 5 are implemented, creating a firm buffer of 2 miles around ferruginous hawk nests, and the East Solar Field is within one of those buffers, then yes, it would be excluded.
Okay. So I actually want to make that clear, and I support that for a couple of reasons. And I think I asked you also to have a map ready to show the council as to why. But I also wanted to make it clear to the council that we were also potentially talking about, that the rest of the East Solar Field. So this is a picture from the initial application, which shows habitat types. The break in between the two pieces, I believe that's that I-82 again. And the western portion has already been eliminated from the project by the applicant in terms
I
of
can
the
show
solar
you,
field.
this is indicative of the areas highlighted in green are areas that the applicant has already committed to excluding from consideration.
Oh, all the areas in green. Okay.
Correct. So it is essentially limited to, their current proposal is this, these two locations, this location, and essentially this much of these two locations.
And what I want to draw your attention to for the council members is the two that have a background color of green and kind of brown, which currently, if you look at the habitat types, that's not agricultural land. That is other kinds of habitats as shrub steppe, well, not necessarily shrub steppe.
they're classified here as unidentified shrub and unidentified grasslands.
Thank you. I was trying to read the very small print on there. And so for those reasons, I am concerned about a number of things, including within those areas that perhaps the hawk might be most likely to forage on, areas that have not been developed, as well as traditional cultural properties and impact on cultural resources. So I want to make it, I guess I want to make a statement that I support the elimination of the East Solar Field from consideration. I went back and I looked at the original application and read that the applicant is currently studying, this is again from the original application, multiple potential solar array sites, one on the east side of the project lease boundary, and up to 2 potential sites on the west side. A determination of which of these potential solar array sites would be chosen has not yet been made. So considering all of that, I'm proposing that the East Solar Field be removed as a condition for approval for the project. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay.
Okay, so is it the council's direction that we incorporate that as a condition of an SCA were one to be written?
Council members, do you want to? If they're not speaking, we'll assume it's agreed.
Okay.
Lenny.
Yeah,
Mr. Young.
I support what Chair Drew just described. I support that.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Returning to the potential changes to species 5, is there are there any questions or comments from the council on this first version of the potential changes to the ferruginous hawk mitigation?
This is Stacy Brewster. I'd just throw my support behind this version of the mitigation, that the boundaries are firm and there'll be no encroachment in nesting areas.
Okay. And would the council like this to apply to all project components or portions?
Mr. Young?
Yeah, I also support the change. I would say it applies to all project components. And I think it's important that we note that when we're talking about the 2-mile radius, it's not, we're talking about everything within that 2-mile radius, all the ground. And we're not just talking about areas that have a vegetation type that is thought to be foraging habitat or something that's specifically used by the hawks. The way this is written and the way I believe it's intended is that it covers the entire area within that 2-mile radius.
Yes, and that was another change that was made to this mitigation based on your comments from last time, where the use of the word habitat in the first sentence has been changed to area, just to make it abundantly clear.
Thank you. The only question I have remaining again is thinking through whether there would need to be any consideration of any transmission connected if it completely bisects the project. Mr. Livingston.
Yeah, so it's the red dots on the map that Sean's showing right now are those class 3 impacts. So those are multiple impacts, not necessarily just from ferruginous hawk. So it's you know, and I understand why we're doing it this way, but it's really difficult to understand by looking at this map what it exactly means for all project components, right? So just wanted to highlight that. You know, transmission lines, power lines, I would feel more comfortable, and I'm saying that not an absolute no on that. But I'd feel more comfortable if FSEC staff reached out to WDFW staff and asked that question about the concerns. I mean, certainly turbines, the primary concern, direct loss of habitat from solar arrays are another concern. Transmission lines may or may not be in this expansive of an area. So I'd like to hear how they would respond to that question. I really appreciate removing the uncertainty that this had before, because I just didn't know what I would be voting for. If I vote yes, I didn't know what I'd be voting for at the final outcome of the project. So this is certainly helpful for me.
Ms. Hafkemeyer?
Would the council be interested in reviewing prior to the January meeting a revised mitigation as discussed today, including additional feedback from DFW subject matter experts?
Is that what you're asking for, Mr. Livingston?
Yes.
Okay. So let's proceed with, if we are to move forward with a conditioned project, let's proceed with this as the revised written. Certainly if we want to, if we go in that direction, we want to tweak it in January, we still can do that.
Okay.
Is that agreeable to council members? Okay.
Okay. Are there any further questions on this one or this version of species 5? We can probably skip the second version of species 5 then. That primarily just replaced the role of the PTAG and the administration of this measure with WDFW based on council thoughts. But
yeah, I agree. We can skip that one.
Next is species 8 for the prairie falcon. The council had indicated that they would like to see pre-construction winter surveys be performed for this species. That's been added to this measure. Are there any questions for this change? Okay. Species 13 for the pronghorn antelope. There was council discussion about whether the database of observations that the applicant would maintain during operation should be confidential or not, with the understanding that that final determination would be made between discussions of the Yakama Nation and the council. Language has been added here indicating that the database may be determined to be confidential when it's developed. Other questions here? Okay. Energy 6, which deals with the recycling of project components. There was a question from the council as to whether FSEC or the applicant would be responsible for determining the recyclability of components. So language has been added that the applicant has to provide justification for the non-recycling of any project components to FSEC, and FSEC will have the final determination about whether or not a component can be recycled, and if so, it would be required to be. Any questions here? Okay. The next is Recreation 1, which it involves recreational activity coordination. There's two parts here. The first was a concern that was expressed that DNR was more involved in this measure than they necessarily should be, and that DNR only maintains responsibility for impacts to its own lands. So language has been added to indicate that entities may only be consulted for impacts to recreation impacts to their own administered lands. The second part of council commentary was whether or not additional entities should be added for coordination. BLM was one of the suggestions. So the potential for additional entities has been added to the language as well. Are there any questions for this measure? Next is the Recreation Safety Management Plan. The council had questions about what FSEC's role would be in regulating the accomplishment of this mitigation. So language has been added indicating that FSEC would be responsible for determining whether or not the applicant had sufficiently coordinated with all relevant entities that promote recreational activities within the lease boundary to clarify that regulatory role for FSEC. Are there any questions here?
Just to make sure I understand what area we're talking about within the project area, the least boundary of the project area, which is larger than the siting corridor and the project components, but beyond all the area which is leased.
Correct. The applicant is responsible for all impacts within the lease boundary, which are all lands that have been leased by the applicant, whether or not they cite project components on them.
Okay.
So. Any other questions? Okay. This is the final change from council suggestions, which involves the requirement for a decommissioning housing survey to be performed prior to the start of decommissioning. There was a council request that this analysis be consistent with Washington Department of Labor and Industries guidelines. So that has been added to the language of the mitigation. Are there any questions here? Okay. I would like to begin the other list of changes, potential changes to mitigation that the council was provided with last week. These are changes that staff have come up with following discussions with the applicant and are primarily meant to clarify mitigation measures that might be that could use potential clarification. There are no changes here that staff believes materially weaken any mitigation measures. The first was the requirement that the applicant adhere to least risk fish windows for all work within ephemeral and intermittent streams. Following discussion with the applicant and staff at WDFW, it was determined that these least risk fish windows are intended only to be used to apply to in-water work in streams with flowing water. So the language has been changed to indicate that these windows would be maintained during periods where these ephemeral and intermittent streams actually have water in them. Are there council questions on this change? Okay. The next is Vegetation 9, which deals with the maintenance of vegetation on solar array fencing. There was a request from the applicant to establish a more specific protocol and periodicity for fence clearing. And in consultation with our consultant, we've developed this language that indicates that a monthly fence survey would be conducted during periods where wildfire danger rating, as determined by DNR, is assessed as low, And when that rating is assessed as moderate or higher, then weekly surveys would be required. And these surveys would include the removal of any built up of vegetation, such as tumbleweeds. Are there any questions on this potential change? Okay. The next is the species-specific mitigation for Townsend's ground squirrel. As it was initially written, the mitigation measure required surveys for Townsend ground squirrel colonies within the lease boundary and the ZOI, the zone of influence. As defined in the EIS, the zone of influence is a half-mile buffer around the lease boundary. And this mitigation measure would have required the applicant to have access and have legal access to areas outside of site control. So that the requirement for surveys within the ZOI has been removed in this version. Staff believes that the mitigation measure remains effective at mitigating impacts to the species with this change. Are there questions on this potential change? Okay. The next is Visual 3, which requires that turbines in the cells be maintained to be clean to avoid any buildup of fluids or dirt. The applicant had indicated that turbine cleanings are generally done in batches, not one at a time. So they requested a version of this mitigation that would allow for cleanings to only take place when a specific number of turbines had been determined to be not clean. And they also requested more clarification about how to define clean. And this version of mitigation allows for AFSEC to make those determinations, both whether or not a turbine is clean and how many turbines would not need to be not clean before requiring a cleaning crew to be dispatched.
This is Stacy Brewster. Just one question on this. Is this something that's determined throughout the life of the project, or is it set in place prior to approval?
In terms of the numbers, it would be a process that we would work with the applicant in determining how to define clean, and then the actual numbers of turbines that would be necessary to be not clean before requiring a cleaning crew is something that we would also work with the applicant through the life of the project. Okay. So a higher number in a more condensed area, or pardon me, a lower number in a more condensed area may require a crew, whereas if it's a higher number in a more dispersed area, it's open to that kind of ongoing discussion.
Thank you.
Do we know if there's best practice regarding?
So regarding
cleaning of the nacelles and towers? I mean, I expect there are a lot of wind farms across the country, but.
I don't know the specific best management practices for the actual process of the cleaning.
Okay, I'm sure that we'll have a chance perhaps to look into that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions on this measure? Okay, the next is Visual 5, which is a requirement for opaque fencing within half a mile of any, in the original language, key observation points. To add clarity to the measure, we've removed the reference to key observation points and replaced it with linear viewpoints and residences. Just to clarify that it does apply to all such receptor sites, not just those that were specifically identified as KOPs within the visual simulations. Are there questions on this measure? Okay. Next is the shadow flicker mitigation. There are two parts here. The first is the initial language included the phrase or included a requirement that the blades of the turbines be stopped during periods of perceptible shadow flicker. As explained by the applicant, stopping or locking the turbine blades for extended periods of time or during high winds can result in significant damage to turbines. And in previous projects, we have not required that the blades themselves be stopped. We have required that operation of the turbine be stopped to allow the blades to flow freely in the wind. So they will still be moving. They will just be moving at a much lower speed, and as a result, cause less shadow flicker. And the second part of this is an acknowledgement that shadow flicker as a phenomenon is fairly limited. It's limited based on the angle of the sun, the wind speeds, and the sky conditions, whether there are clouds or clear skies. Just to indicate that not all shadows cast by these turbines on non-participating sites are necessarily qualify as shadow flicker. Are there questions on these changes? Okay. The next is Recreation 1. There have already been changes to this measure that the council had proposed, so if the council desires, we can merge these changes. But the applicant was concerned that this measure was unbounded. It had no set guidelines for how it would be determined to have been successfully achieved. So language has been added that indicated that FSEC would be responsible for determining whether the applicant had sufficiently coordinated with all relevant entities to promote recreational activities within the vicinity of the lease boundary.
Oh, Mr. Young.
Could this language on the right-hand side, the change, be broadened out the way that the previous section on recreation was to not seem to indicate that it is DNR and Benton County who are somehow jointly managing all the recreation in the project area? Could we go back and bring in some of that other language to modify this a little bit more?
Yes, absolutely. If the council desires, we can merge the changes here with the changes that were proposed by the council for the same mitigation measure and use that as the version of the text to incorporate into an SCA should one be developed.
That's what That's what I would favor.
Okay. Any other questions on this measure? The next, the concerns that the applicant had were fairly similar to the Recreation and Safety Management Plan, and this is again a measure where the council had recommended changes of their own. So if the council desire, we could merge the changes. The applicant was concerned that the measure was unbounded and had no set guidelines for how it would be determined to have been achieved. And similar language has been added here indicating that FSEC would make that determination as to whether or not the applicant had sufficiently coordinated with all relevant entities. Are there questions about these changes? Okay.
Mr. Young?
Yeah, again, some type of a language merger would seem to be helpful
Yes.
here.
And if you want, I can bring up the council's version so you can see where the changes were.
I think we'll just look for
Okay.
it to be merged and then have a chance to see it there.
Okay. And I think that's it. Yeah. So those are all the changes that were proposed by the council or were arrived at by staff through discussions with the applicant.
Thank you. We are now at the point in our meeting today where our next step would be to ask the staff to prepare the documents for a recommendation to the governor. Previous councils have used the intent section of the FSEC statute 80 RCW 80.50.010 to guide their decision-making process. So I've asked for Ms. Grantham to put that RCW section on our screen. And I think the focus in terms of the legislative finding, as you can zero in on the words that start about 3/4 from the bottom, such action will be based on these premises. Do you see that? Can you enlarge that so that we're looking at that? There we go. I think there's one more, so there's 6. So there's, right. There we go. Oh, 6 is on the next page in that. Okay. Sorry about that. It ended up on the same page on mine. And as we look at what step we want to take, I'll just briefly verbally go over the direction in our statute to assure that citizens where applicable that operational safeguards are at least as stringent as the federal government, to preserve and protect the quality of the environment, to enhance the public's opportunity to enjoy the aesthetic and recreational benefits of the air, water, and land resources, to promote air cleanliness, to pursue beneficial changes in the environment, and to promote environmental justice for overburdened communities, to encourage the development and integration of clean energy sources, to provide abundant clean energy at reasonable cost, to avoid costs of complete site restoration and demolition of improvements in infrastructure at unfinished nuclear energy sites. That's not part of what we're looking at here. And to avoid costly duplication in the siting process and ensure that decisions are made timely and without unnecessary delay, while also encouraging meaningful public comment and participation in energy facility decisions. So that's our charge as we move to the next phase of consideration. I don't know if anybody has questions about that. As you can see, and as I think we're well aware, those require looking both at the environmental impacts, the need for clean energy, the impact on communities, and on overburdened environmental justice for overburdened communities as well. So I just wanted to bring that forward as we move to thinking about all that we've learned from reviewing this project, from the many public comments, concerns that have been raised from the adjudication, and our consideration of all that has been brought up there, and from our environmental impact statement and the mitigations that are brought forward in the final environmental impact statement as we've reviewed and modified them. To prepare for our final recommendation to the governor, we need to ask the staff to prepare those documents. As you can see, we want to make sure when we're talking about conditions that we fully understand what those conditions might be if we are moving in that direction. And that would provide us with the basis for further deliberations and a final vote on the recommendation to the governor at a later meeting. In my view, we have three options. One option is to ask the staff to prepare documents to approve the Horse Heaven project as the applicant has modified it. A second is to ask the staff to prepare the documents to reject the Horse Heaven project. And a third option is to ask the staff to prepare documents to approve the Horse Heaven project with the conditions that were identified in the final EIS as we have discussed and modified them during today's discussion. So I would ask council members if you have a preferred option you want to consider at this point in time. Mr. Young.
Yep. Chair Drew, I'm not sure we're ready to make that decision today. We haven't had any discussion about mitigation of impacts to TCPs, to traditional cultural properties, and I personally have not thoroughly read what the FEIS is specifying on that topic. How do you think that factors into where we are today?
That's a really good question. And I guess myself, I've spent quite a fair amount of time reviewing the map that we saw. Perhaps that map can be brought up again. That identified the most impactful turbines are identified in red. What I understand we've done would be included as a condition would be to eliminate all of the turbines on this map from consideration because they are highly impactful in a number of ways. One way we specifically talked about is that they are within the 2-mile buffer of the ferruginous hawk. They also impact cultural resources. We have the confidential maps that we have looked at in terms of the impact on the number of traditional cultural properties. So elimination of these turbines won't eliminate all impacts to traditional cultural properties, but will eliminate a significant impacts. I don't feel that I can qualify that in a very specific way. In addition to that, eliminating these turbines, if you're to look at those turbines that have the most impact on the community in terms of visual resources, the community at large, I'm not talking about but I'm not talking about specific residences that are in the area. But as you can see from this map, this is the face to the larger, to the community at large. And so that will significantly reduce the visual impact. It will reduce the number of turbines close to the ridge line for firefighting purposes as we look at those issues as we continue to look at that with the help of the Department of Natural Resources. Turbines would be further away from, we understand that we would not expect to have drones and other aerial firefighting equipment within where the turbines are. But this moves them away from the slope of the hill, which is really where that equipment, as I understand it from the testimony we've had, has been used in the past. So as I look at the map, and thank you for asking me the question, because that all is in my mind from the review that we have conducted, and we've talked about the wildlife corridors as well. And therefore, I do think, in my opinion, that we can move forward at this point to ask the staff to prepare documents to condition the project in this way. I would like to hear other opinions.
I might ask that we consider asking staff to prepare a couple of variants. And one variant that I'd like to see us at least think about at this point would be eliminating all the turbines and all the work east of Straub Canyon, which is roughly in the middle of the project, running generally north-south. And my primary push around that is around TCP.
Mr. Livingston. Okay, you could continue. Go ahead, Mr.
No,
Young.
go ahead. I said what I needed to
there. At this point, I'm where Lenny is. We talked about some additional restrictions on the project. I can't put all those pieces together looking at this map and what we talked about. The wildfire, aerial wildfire fighting isn't something that, you know, I'd like to see what that looks like and just assure that we have those covered where we might do setbacks. The wildlife corridor, it would be very helpful for me to see that, you know, how's that affect the various turbines? And then the other question is, where are you, Chair Drew, as far as the yellow, so the 2 impact areas versus 3 impacts in the red? Are you saying we remove class 2 impacts as well, or 3? Those are just a few things for me right now that I feel like I'd like to see another iteration of this before I provide my, input on which direction to go.
So I'm certainly open to the class 2 impacts, and even the class 1 impacts. I'm primarily, I guess, looking, because it's easier to see the color green on here and the color red than it is to see those. But I do want to know if you're talking about where a canyon is. I don't, maybe the staff can help me where that line is. Okay.
Yes, Chair Drew, Straub Canyon is this roughly north-south running canyon that goes through here. You can see my marker. Yeah.
Okay.
Are you able to see it?
Yes, thank you. Other comments?
This is Stacy Brewster. I guess just a question about if we move today to have staff prepare a document with the conditions that we've laid out so far, is how malleable is that document as we consider a bit further? Are changes still able to be made?
Ms. Hofkemeyer?
Thank you. So what staff can do is prepare documents, including maybe some placeholders for some different conditions where we've highlighted, different degrees of specificity, not degrees of specificity, but where the council would like to consider potential different exclusions and conditions as we get responses from DNR on aerial firefighting, and as we get information from DFW on potentially making allowances for ancillary infrastructure such as transmission, and generally prepare documents to condition the project and have placeholders for some of that variation to allow the council to review those distinctions ahead of the January meeting. And then if the council would like to discuss further at the January meeting and provide staff with the sort of, ultimate direction based on those options or another variation thereof based on your discussion, staff could then make those edits following your discussion on the January 24th meeting. I think that we would want to frame the discussion at that time so that staff has clear direction on what the council would ultimately like to see so that we can have everything submitted ahead of our January 31st deadline for recommendation to the governor.
And I'll comment a little bit about that because that is one of the drivers. But I think that if it happens that we don't make that deadline, we'll figure out how to adjust that because I think we'll be pretty close. What I do hear, and I appreciate it, is I hear the council coalescing, and tell me if I'm wrong, around the option 3 to approve the project potentially as long as we address the conditions that I've heard everybody talk about even in this conversation. That doesn't mean that we can't go back and say, no, it doesn't work, right? But if we ask the staff to start working on a potential recommendation, that would include options. Does that meet the needs of council members? Mr. Young?
Yeah, I would say yes. I certainly do not favor the option you mentioned of that we would proceed thinking we could approve the project the way it has been described by the applicant. And I don't think we're at a absolute no. There's no part of this that could ever be done. We're in that middle
Okay.
ground. I would agree with that.
Okay. Very good. Do we need further? I guess we'll move forward and have a motion to ask the staff to prepare documents to approve the project with the conditions we've talked about and with options as we've discussed in preparation for a more final decision in January. Do you need more specificity than that?
I would just also like to ask the council if they would like staff to incorporate the other mitigation measures in the final EIS that were not discussed for revision.
Oh.
But would the council like to see those included in draft documents as well as they are in the FEIS?
Thank you. So we would have the documents with the conditions identified as mitigations in the final EIS, plus the ones that we have refined and the ones that we may have some options on moving forward. Yes, we would want all of those conditions included. Okay. Is there a motion then to ask the staff to prepare these documents to approve the Horse Heaven project with the conditions that were identified in the final EIS and with the refinements that were made today, allowing for some options to be considered in a future meeting?
Stacy Brewster, so moved.
Mr. Young?
Eli Levitt, second.
So I guess I'll jump in here as now we have a motion on the table. I would like to ensure that the option we're asking staff to develop, whether it's a sub option or what, but that one of the things that is being considered and what staff puts together is what I asked before, is the, excluding all of the project that is east of Strub Canyon.
Yes. Friendly amendment.
Friendly amendment.
Is there any discussion, any further discussion? Okay. There's a lot of information that we've received and a lot of considerations moving forward. And I appreciate everybody's work individually and the staff's work on this. All those in favor of this motion, please signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed to this motion, please say nay. The motion is adopted. Thank you. At this point in time, we have an employee update. Go ahead, Ms. Massengale.
Thank you, Chair Drew. I'm Lisa Massengale. I'm the Public Records Officer and the Records Program Manager for FSEC, and I'm very pleased to introduce Audra Allen, our new Forms and Records Analyst 3. She joins FSEC from DSHS, where she has over 5 years of experience in public disclosure. I'll go ahead and pass the microphone to Audra to introduce herself to the council.
Lisa did already such a great job. Yeah, I'm moved to Washington 5 years ago from Austin, Texas. I've been working for the state since then. I'm very happy to be here and look forward to meeting everyone.
Thank you, and you're welcome to the staff.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. If there's nothing further to come before the council, our meeting is adjourned.